Thanks for joining us. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Today we have rather big news. This is because the UK has announced the conclusion of the trade talks of member countries for joining the CPTPP, or the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm at the British High Commission here in Kuala Lumpur in conversation with the British High Commissioner to Malaysia, Charles Hay. Charles, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. It's actually a pleasure to have you on the show for today. It is, of course, a momentous event. Maybe you can talk to us through the idea of the UK concluding the talks of CPTPP. It hasn't been joined yet, but at least the talks are done.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe give us a little bit of background on that.
Yes, well, this is a great day, as you say. This is the culmination of talks which have been going on now for quite some time. We put our application in over 2 years ago, but in fact we'd started preliminary discussions up to 2 years before that, so it's the culmination of a great deal of work. And for the UK, this is a really important part of our establishing new trade relationships as we leave or have left the European Union.
Of course, there is that whole notion of the UK trying to find your own path towards global or regional trade partnerships. Maybe you can give us the idea of why the UK wants to join the CPTPP in the first place.
So having left the European Union, of course, we left all the trade arrangements that were in place under the European Union. And the CPTPP is the single most exciting and biggest trade bloc that we could have aspired to join. And we're the first European country to join and the first new country beyond the original members. And it's a really important agreement for us. It's a bloc that brings together with the UK now joining, about 15% of global trade. So it brings lots of important opportunities for us.
And of course, this marks a shift in foreign policy towards a global, more dynamic market. Do you feel that this is one step into the major idea of moving towards a greater approach of building partnerships across European borders? Do you feel that joining the CPTPP is a signal that the shift of foreign policy of the UK government is actually quite clear? And what does it mean for the UK residents moving forward?
So CPTPP, of course, is all about trade. I mean, it goes beyond trade in goods. It includes trade in services, digital trade, and so on. But it's part of a much bigger picture, as you say. And if you look back over the past 2 or 3 years, or the 4 years that I've been here, the UK became dialogue partner with ASEAN, the first new dialogue partner with ASEAN in I think 25 years. We're already strong in this region, so we're a member of the 5 power defence arrangements with Malaysia, Singapore, Australia and New Zealand. We've always had a very strong relationship with Malaysia, but now we're increasing our footprint and our presence in the whole region. And that's in line with the UK government tilt, as we're calling it, towards the Indo-Pacific region.
And of course, we're looking at regulatory cooperation across various sectors, from food security, defense, as you mentioned, many more. Do you feel that that whole idea of regulatory cooperation is going to create some sort of a closer tie, closer than we ever have been before?
Well, it will bring the economies of CPTPP members closer, that's for sure. I mean, for example, it will make it much easier for companies to have supply lines, product lines across the whole CPTPP region. And it's particularly important for the UK and Malaysia because up to this point we've never had a free trade arrangement of any kind with Malaysia. So this brings a lot of new opportunities for UK and Malaysia.
Which is quite interesting because I want to focus a little bit more into the benefits, I suppose, of Malaysia and the UK in the framework of the CPTPP. You're right, the cooperation actually is quite close. In fact, there are mega projects that are currently being done both in the UK and in Malaysia. As recent as October last year, I was at the Battersea project, and some of the contractors from Malaysia are supplying goods and services for the Battersea project. That's just an example, of course. But at the same time, there would be issues surrounding regulatory cooperation where things need to be ironed out. Where do you see the potential challenges or the hiccups that is needed in order for us to achieve that whole free trade arrangement that all of us aspire to?
So CPTPP, concluding the negotiations, about to become a member, that's a really big thing. But it's only the start of a journey, because what we now need to do is to fully understand the opportunities that this brings and then work together to exploit them. And in fact, I was in London last week discussing how we were going to take this forward with a number of people, including our UK trade envoy, with the Malaysian High Commissioner, And we've got a lot of work ahead of us to do this. Some of it's already quite clear. So for example, tariffs will be reduced across a huge number of goods. We can see that from the agreement that's already been published. But the deeper forms of agreement, for example, on digital trade, services, which are going to be really important, I think that will only start to become apparent as we start to get into the agreement and as we get our businesses to look at the agreement and work out how they're going to benefit from it.
And of course, we're looking at investments as well, both domestic direct investment, FDI between the two countries. Do you see, at least hypothetically, a greater amount of investment going into these two countries?
I think we will see that following from these new opportunities. And I think that's what you see through free trade agreements. It kind of opens up new channels between the economies. We've already got great channels between the UK and Malaysia. You referred to the Battersea Power Station project. I was there too in October. That was an amazing example of investment into the UK. There's others, like for example, the huge development in Bristol that YTL are building now on the old British Aerospace airfield. So there are countless examples. I think we'll see more.
Talent mobility is also a key aspect of this. Already we've seen how there's a lot of British citizens here living, working, making a life here, vice versa, Malaysians in the UK as well. The cooperation couldn't have been much closer, but I would imagine mobility and talent movement would be even closer now more than ever. Do you feel that that is going to be the future for talent management?
I think it will be, and in fact the CPTPP agreement makes provision for, to make it easier, for example, for business people in certain sectors to come for longer periods of time to run their businesses and so on. So there are specific parts of CPTPP that cover that. But again, it'll be part of the general wider thickening of our relations, which, as you say, are already very strong. I mean, about 14,000 Malaysians are currently studying in the UK, for example, and I expect we'll see these growing even more in the future.
One more, actually. My daughter's sitting there soon.
Very good.
This summer. I don't like it, but she apparently likes it. So let's see how that one pans out, just like how the CPTPP pans out. We'll go for one short break. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion with Charles Hay, the British High Commissioner to Malaysia. Thanks for staying on with us. I have the British High Commissioner to Malaysia, Charles Hay. Charles, let's talk a little bit more about the wider scope of the arrangement right now. Part of the talks, the challenges that the UK government had to deal with was some of the objections that was raised by, say, for instance, Canada in terms of the arrangement of food or meat restrictions. These are just some of the examples of the things that needed to be ironed out. There were concessions that was made by the UK. Do you feel that that is the way forward where members or participating countries who wants to join the CPTPP, they have to be cognizant of the requirements that is needed to be a part of a trade arrangement such as this? Concessions have to be made, but looking back, that would be better moving forward to have these kind of arrangements at a larger scope. Do you feel that more concessions must be made by the UK government in order for the ascension to be materialized?
So every free trade agreement, as you know, involves concessions on both sides, give and take. That's what makes them so hard. That's why Absolutely. We've been doing this one, for as I said, for the last 4 years or so. And these can be very sensitive. I mean, the most sensitive areas, generally speaking, tend to be agriculture. Yeah. And we see that in every free trade agreement. But I'm delighted that we've come through all this and we've now got substantive agreement. And of course there were concessions made. It's a bit different when you're joining an existing arrangement as we were here, because of course you then pretty much have to take most of what's already agreed and you have to accept that in order to even start the negotiations. But there were lots of things that needed to be ironed out and I think we came to a good solution which benefits all sides.
One would argue that the British Prime Ministership as well as the Malaysian Prime Ministership have seen a lot of changes over the past few years. For better or worse, this is the situation that we're facing right now. It also marks a shift in terms of how the executive administration is going to plot the future of the governments of both countries moving forward. other members within the CPTPP might not be as blessed as us in having so many prime ministers in the past few years. Having said that, because of the shifting changes of prime ministers, signaling shifting changes of executive decisions, do you think that this is going to bring a lot more volatility in terms of how talks are going to be organized moving forward? Not just between Malaysia and Britain, but of course moving forward for all CPTPP members.
Well, of course, as talks or negotiations are in train, as and when there are changes of government, of course, any new government will want to look at what's been agreed and maybe change it. But when you ink the agreement, as we now have, that's all over and done with. I think we are in a good place, and we've got there through, as you say, a period of quite significant political instability in both the UK and Malaysia, and other CPTPP countries as well. But I think that's all behind us in the sense that we can now go ahead and implement the agreement in good faith. And
it's also quite interesting that the current British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has achieved a breakthrough in terms of the post-Brexit agreement. This, of course, is not just the handiwork of himself per se, but the long-standing work of the civil servants in the UK in trying to achieve that post-Brexit breakthrough arrangement. Considering that there is an arrangement right now between the UK with the Eurozone member countries and the EU, would that also signal a smoothening movement of trying to achieve a greater participation for CPTPP membership as well as other memberships around the world for free trade?
So the recently concluded Windsor framework, as it's called, and this is also actually is about trade between UK, Ireland, the EU. These things are always really complicated, and they come down into quite fine details, of product regulation and goods harmonisation and so on and so forth. That framework has now been agreed between the UK and the EU, and that permits free and smooth movement of trade between the UK, Northern Ireland and Ireland. And that, I think, was an important part of the backdrop to the negotiation of CPTPP, because with that regulated and clarified, that was one of the pieces that needed to fall into place.
And this, of course, includes the backstop of Ireland and Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, all of that is set out in the Windsor framework, including the so-called stallment break, which provides a veto in certain circumstances. It gets terribly complicated.
Okay, let's not get into that, I suppose.
But as I say, all that being resolved clarified the way, if you like, towards CPTPP negotiations.
There has been long-standing issues when it comes to, say, for instance, Malaysia in trying to establish closer economic ties with the EU, particularly in respect of, say, palm oil industries and the industries associated with it. Do you feel that these kind of hiccups might not necessarily be impacted for Malaysia when it comes to the UK in CPTPP?
So for those viewers who don't know, up until the UK left the European Union, trade policy was in the hands of the EU. That's how it works. So the EU conduct negotiations. And the EU have been conducting negotiations on and off with Malaysia for at least the last 10 years on a free trade agreement. That has not been concluded, which is why when the UK came to join CPTPP, there was no pre-existing free trade agreement with Malaysia. And of course, palm oil is one of those commodities that is important when it comes to trade negotiations, and we had to come to an agreement on, for example, tariff levels for palm oil as part of that CPTPP negotiation.
Blue skies, I guess, scenario. Where do you see opportunities of growth when it comes to industries, not just between the UK and Malaysia, but CPTPP membership in the UK? Where do you see the UK can expound on growth after joining CPTPP eventually?
Malaysia is already a really important part of many British companies' supply chains. So goods produced here, particularly in the electric and electronics sector, then form part of other goods which are then traded onwards by UK companies. I think we can see a lot more of that. As I said before, CPTPP, now because there's smooth free trade between all members of CPTPP, it's possible to conceive of supply chains spanning multiple CPTPP countries. So I think we might see interesting developments there. I think it's good news for British car manufacturers because tariffs on British cars will fall progressively over the coming years, and that's just one example of where we might see growth in goods trade. But as I said, the most interesting and important trade for the future, I think, will be in services.
Taking our conversation away from trade and looking at the geopolitical situation around the world, there has been a lot of conversations into how countries that are not necessarily aligned with, say, Russia or even China, needs to band closer together. There are movements across the geopolitical divide that needs to be discussed openly and honestly. Our Prime Minister is currently in China, for instance, and of course the reason why he's there is because he's trying to build some cooperation with China. Not many people are looking forward to such a conversation, but such conversations has to be made. Do you feel that the sensitivity of the geopolitical movements around the world is actually quite critical to be discussed right now? We have to, in a way, choose sides. Do you agree with these kind of statements?
The geopolitical situation has definitely got more complex in the last year since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. That's had huge knock-on effects in trade everywhere. I mean, most obviously in energy, but also other commodities. It's pushed up prices of food globally, disrupted supply lines, and I think what we've seen is a move away from trade with Russia for all sorts of reasons, not least because being dependent on a country like Russia for your energy supplies increasingly looks like a very bad idea. China is very, very important, of course, in the world trading environment. So all of our countries have huge trading relationships with China. I think they're Malaysia's biggest trading partner. They're one of our biggest trading partners. I think they're our biggest trading partner in goods. China is a very, very important place. There are lots of business opportunities in China. But there are also problems in the way that China approaches its relationships with many countries in the world. And that starts to bring risk into trading relationships. And a big part of the UK's integrated refresh of our foreign policy has been to look at how we manage that relationship with China. How do we define China? How do we reduce those risks and try to encourage a move for China on a more, as we would see it, a more positive path?
When I spoke to the EU ambassador to Malaysia, and when I spoke with the Undersecretary of State Department of the of the US in Asia Pacific, they too echo what you're saying right now, where trade is actually quite critical for all countries when it comes to China, but the way they approach things can be quite abrasive in a way. Malaysia also has, our own, love-hate kind of relationship with China, especially when it comes to border incursions, the 9 dotted line, many others, Spratly Islands, and you name it. Do you think that these kind of situations can only be resolved through trade, or I should rephrase that? Do you think that trade could be a tool, an effective tool to address all these geopolitical concerns moving forward?
Trade is an important part of a healthy set of relationships around the world.
People don't normally go to war when they have good trade with each other, I suppose.
Not normally. There are, or rather, there are very big prices to be paid when you go to war with people with whom you have a good trading relationship.
Yeah.
We all hope that diplomacy will be the way through this, diplomacy and trade, because that creates lots of incentives not to go down the road of hostility and belligerence and aggression. And as we've seen with Russia, if you do go down the road of war, then it has massively disruptive and damaging impacts on your economy, on your people, on your trading relationships, which will never. So when we look at what's happening in Russia, those energy trading relationships that Russia relied on, I don't think will ever come back, whatever happens, however the war in Ukraine is resolved.
A very macabre observation that I made very recently when it comes to the Russian incursion of Ukraine, or the Russian war in Ukraine, is that energy policies are shifted to reduce reliance on Russia, and is only precipitated because of the war. So war does bring about a necessary move to rethink on energy supply, at least for the European area as well as the UK. Do you feel that there is no turning back when it comes to energy reliance in Russia now, especially from the UK?
I think as far as Europe is concerned, and the Americans know, there's no turning back. We won't go back to looking on Russia as being a key energy provider. I think there's another thing that's going to happen, or is maybe already happening, which is positive in a way, which is that it will speed up the transition towards net zero and a move away from fossil fuels.
Yeah, this is the thing, right? And we needed a war to make that happen. That's pretty sad, actually.
We needed a disruption of some kind. I mean, you would have thought that the disruptions we're already seeing in climate change would be enough to jolt that change, and the change was already happening. I think what's happened is it's going to be accelerated.
Domestically speaking, in the UK, energy prices have been soaring, and you know, the regular folks inside the UK, some of them even have to choose to put either, you know, food on the table or switch on the heater, and it's during the winter period. Domestically speaking, the UK needs to go through a lot of transition in terms of trying to improve the livelihoods of British citizens. Do you feel that these kind of trade partnerships can translate down towards the regular British citizens, and they could see better economic possibilities moving forward?
I think they do, and I think that in a way is what they're all about, because if you boost I mean, we go back to Adam Smith's theory of trade, right? Countries specialize in what they're good at. So if you're better at growing a particular product, then if you export it, the consumers at the other end get a cheaper product than if they bought it from somewhere else. I mean, that's the basic principle, and I think it works in practice.
Okay, and of course, the final area that I would like to explore is, of course, not trade, not diplomacy, not geopolitics, but more of culture, arts, the softer side of things. Because of trade relationships, I've seen some elements of growth in these areas. Do you feel that culture can actually be improved following these kind of closer ties between countries through trade partnerships? And how do you see this as a catalytic movement in terms of improving culture and livelihood for our citizens?
I think there are very strong links between trade and culture and education, but I think they work in quite complex ways. So one of the things that has been really important for the UK-Malaysia relationship is how many Malaysians have studied in the UK. And we don't know how many. We think maybe up to 500,000 Malaysians have studied.
Really?
Yes, either school, university, or whatever. That is huge, because it means that huge numbers of Malaysians are very familiar with the UK.
Kampung London.
Well, London, not just London. I've met so many Malaysians who are familiar with my own kampung in Scotland.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and not just for golf. But what that means is that, let's say you're a Malaysian businessman and you're looking to set up a new product line or whatever, then what country do you think of first? You think of the UK, because you studied there, or your son's studying there, or whatever. So that enhances the trading relationship, and it becomes a kind of virtuous cycle. Yeah. Yeah, because you also become more familiar with the culture.
Generational, actually.
Exactly. And I think the problem that we have in the UK is that we don't have as much flow going the other way. We don't have nearly as many Brits who are so familiar with Malaysia. And one of the things that has come into place...
But those who are here, well, they tend to stay.
They tend to stay.
In a good way, I'm not trying to... Yeah.
Yes, the Malaysia My Second Home is hugely popular amongst Brits. And what we find is that when we do manage to attract a British company to come and look at the Malaysian market, they love it, and they find lots of opportunities here, and they do good business here. So we need to work out ways of encouraging more and more British companies to come to Malaysia, and I think CPTPP will be an important tool in doing that.
So does it mean that this is an opportunity for, say, Ministry of Tourism, for instance, to actually exploit on that movement? I've seen ads on red buses in London, for instance, on Visit Malaysia. Do you think that these kind of activities can actually be enhanced?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And as we come out of the COVID world, already we're seeing tourism numbers going up. I think Malaysia is a very attractive place for British travellers as well.
Okay. Final comment, Charles, when it comes to the UK and its possible ascension to joining the CPTPP?
I think it's all good news. I think it's all good news for the UK, very good news for Malaysia, and very good news for our relationship.
Thank you very much. That was Charles Hay, the British High Commissioner to Malaysia. If you want to learn more about this, just head on to astroawani.com. There's plenty of resources like this that can be found there. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Catch you in the next one.